We begin with our keynotes. We have amongst us, for our very first keynote, one of the grandmasters of editorial design in India, Aurobind Patel. Aurobind Patel first cut his teeth as a typographer for a publishing project while at the Harvard Business School, which he eventually left to follow his true calling, namely design. The seeds of Aurobind Patel's design ethos were sowed very early on in his childhood when mindless copybook doodling as a school student acquainted him with the importance that handwriting and well-formed shapes bear in the great works of typography. In 1982, he joined India Today in Delhi and led the process of revising its design while helping a technical team to implement ATEX, the first magazine pagination system in the country. The visual appeal that made India Today stand apart from its competitors was largely enabled by the technology supporting its production. Aurobind Patel's success with India Today caught the attention of The Economist in London, where he served as the paper's design director from 1987 to 1999, catering to his passion for both design and technology. In 1990, he designed Ecotype, a family of typefaces now used by papers, and later led the charge for the design of Times Millennium, a digital avatar of the eponymous Times Roman for the Times newspaper in London. Now, back in India since 2000, Aurobind Patel divides his time between design assignments and gazing at forms and counterforms. We extend our warmest welcome to Aurobind Patel and invite him on stage for the keynote.
Thank you, Ajanta. It's a pleasure being here. It's always fun to be with people who do the same things and enjoy the same things as you. I said it's a pleasure being with people who share the same passion as you. And every year we gather here and do things we love doing, which is look at fonts and talk about type. So today's lecture, which is the R.K. Joshi Memorial Lecture, I'm going to pay homage to R.K. among others, and generally take a broad sweep at where we are in typography and how we got here. I'll begin with a flawed prognosis, which started about thousands of years ago, long, long ago. The Egyptian deity Thoth, scribe to the gods and inventor of writing, predicted at the time that the invention of writing would lead to the demise of human memory. And the reason that would happen is because humans would have the ability to store their thoughts outside their minds. This was quite a prognosis for someone who invented writing. What happened? Did that really happen? No, not anywhere near as dire as that. Writing became one of mankind's most civilizing inventions, really civilizing. Writing enlightened the human mind by promoting exchange of ideas by means beyond speech. But most of all, writing spawned typography. Without writing, we would have no typography. So here we are today, and this is a very important inflection point in the history of the written word and typography in particular. There were three shifts, if you to look at typography over the millennia. That the first one was the shift in writing, that is, from parchment to vellum. The next one happened from vellum to paper. And the one we are now experiencing is the transition from paper to screen. Parchment to vellum. Now this happened it's a long drawn process. It took a long time. Why did it happen? For obvious reasons. Parchment had a limited life, vellum lasted longer. So this process happened over a long time in early antiquity. The next transition happened when Gutenberg invented printing. And that's from vellum to paper. This was a change that was really fast because it happened over one generation, and this happened in the 15th century. And the last, which is what we are now experiencing, is a transition from paper to screen. This is largely spurred by the personal computer. It's a change that began in the 80s, speeded up by smartphones, which is now the lingua franca of all the young millennials that are around here. this is how they love to communicate. So it's time for all of us to reflect, because we are at a time when we're taking a very old tradition and we are custodians of it. So what's happening? So we have to reflect that with change, conventions that surround the written word appear very fluid. And an example of this is how we use text messaging now. It really changes the way we use language and the written word. We're also free to reimagine the quality of the relationship we make with writing and how we shape new technologies. We also have to remember that we have a burden of tradition, because we can't change things dramatically, because type relies on tradition. So we always need to reflect on how much do we know about the medium's past, what work does writing do for us, what writing tools do we need? And perhaps the first step towards answering these questions is to learn something of how writing got to be the way it is. The first thing we must remember is we're all custodians. We have writing because those before us have toiled to refine and preserve this tradition. Yeah, and if they haven't continued to work as hard as they have, we wouldn't have writing today. For our part, we need to do the same for the generations to follow, or else, as we heard in Omar Khayyam, the moving finger writes, and having writ moves on, nor all your piety or no wit shall lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all your tears wash out a word of it. So we really have a responsibility to make sure writing remains intact. Now we talk and pay homage to the masters. Every age has had writing masters who achieve more than others to preserve this tradition. Edward Johnston was one such at the turn of the century. R.K. Joshi was the other. Each left a palpable influence on type designers, Edward Johnston in the West, R.K. in India. Edward Johnston was a British, Uruguayan-born craftsman who at the turn of the century had revived calligraphy using the broad nib pen, and most profound influence on the revival of writing and typography that followed after that. He was also in many ways responsible for the transition of the black letter to the adoption of the Roman script in Germany, where his students carried on much of his work. Among other things, he designed the first sans serif typeface, which was used by London Underground. This was a commission, and it's also its logo, which is a roundel. In many ways, and this was done in 1913, this was perhaps the first corporate identity or branding undertaking ever undertaken, and it continues to survive. It says a lot about it. But having said that, a lot of Johnston's students were not happy about him. Really, one of them, in fact, felt that when he did the sans serif, he did a great disservice by lending his reputation and name to something as undesirable as a sans serif face, which was something that was ushering modernity into Britain at the time. Anyway, it survived and it did a great job. And what Johnston did was he undertook deep study by looking at old manuscripts, going to libraries, looking at models to understand how writing came to be so that we could replicate it exactly the same way in the new processes that were then emerging. And he was a virtual master. He taught a lot. He was a teacher at the Royal College of Art, among other places. And his blackboard, every day after he finished a class, was a work of art. I mean, there are lots of images. I won't show those because our friend Aichi, who's talking later, will show you a lot of those images, but they were absolutely brilliant works of art. In India, R.K. Joshi did about the same kind of things that Edward Johnston did, except R.K. came much later, and he saw a much bigger kind of change because he saw a change that took printing from metal up to digital, and he participated actively in each of these things. He, as a young man, he was influenced a lot staring at signboards in Kolhapur, where he grew up, and they would fascinate him, these letters. He had a Sanskrit teacher called Mr. Dixit, who wrote beautifully on the blackboard, and Arke would gaze at it, just marveling, not so much at the words, but the beauty of the letters. So somewhere, something struck him as a child. And unlike most people in his family, none of whom were artistic, he chose to pursue art at JJ, which he did, joined an ad agency because that's how he made a living with an art education. But he was always deep down inside concerned about Indian regional languages, its use both in written form as well as spoken as a means of communication. He was among the earliest to start multilingual campaigns because he believed not enough was being done about that. Family planning campaigns in India in many languages. So he was a precursor to all of these movements in India. He did some remarkable work there. Then, to teach himself lettering, or the roots of good letter forms, he spent countless hours at the Asiatic Library studying deeply, as did Johnston at the British Museum. They would cut their own pens to replicate the letters they read and saw on manuscripts, just to understand precisely how the people before them did it. So they were craftsmen in that sense, that by doing you understood, and once you understood, you could teach. And Arke was a master teacher. He loved teaching because he said the thing about teaching is you always remained a student, because every day after you finished in a class, you exhausted all your knowledge and you had to start learning all over again. And he remained that way. He was absolutely curious about everything. I had the good fortune to be his roommate at a conference in Stanford in 1983. It was a conference called the Computer Hand in Type Design. And Arke, in that 5 or 6 days we spent there, barely slept. He was in the lab all night, coding, so that we could see results of the things he was doing the following day. This was long before desktop computers. Everything he did was coded, hard-coded, and he worked long hours, and he worked with Professor Knuth, and he was just insatiable in his lust for knowledge. He worked and developed some of the earliest types we have in digital form for Microsoft. Without him, we wouldn't have any of the digital standards that exist today, because he was instrumental in developing most of the digital standards of encoding we have for Indian typography. So in that sense, he was both looking back and looking ahead, and he really knew his place in history and in time, because he was a real, true custodian of everything that we now have in Indian regional languages in a written form. So the master strokes that were common to both these people, they shared many, many traits. Each was driven to scholarship, enormous amounts of it. Each devoted countless hours to study of manuscripts, EJ at British Museum and Arke at the Asiatic Library. They were both seekers. They were constantly seeking. What were they seeking? They were committed to verifying the truth behind the shape of letters and how they came to be. That was very, very important to Arke. You have to understand how letters came about and how they were constructed. And this gives you an overview. Letters we take for granted every day. We don't even question the use of the alphabet, and here I'm only showing the Roman alphabet, the Latin alphabet. But think of it, the only reason anything works for us is because we all agree on these shapes. If tomorrow someone decides, I'm going to change the shape of the A, the whole alphabet collapses. So it's really a convention that works because we all agree on these shapes. And we agree on these shapes because they're a result of a refinement that has been brought down to us after thousands of years of refinement and thinking by the people that have used it before us. So here we are, 26 letters, We combine them to form words into paragraphs, lines, meaning, and we can use it. And we use it every day without reflecting for a moment where it all started and it came from. It came from the written word. And someone did it years ago, and we continue to do it. Why is it that the shape of the A as we take it to the digital age is still going to be that. Because it's important for it to be that. It can't be anything else because we'll destroy the convention. And so it's really, really important for us to understand, as RK did and as Johnston did, that we are here as custodians to a legacy and a tradition. And if you do our bit right, then the next generation will be able to do it. So shaping of letters, this is what they really spent a lot of their life doing. So it's very important to understand how to shape letters. It's key to both calligraphy and typography. It requires diligence and craftsmanship, lots of it. It's not something you do lightly. RK was someone who taught us that. He never, ever stopped writing or learning. He practiced it like a Zen master. A mastery with tools of the craft. You really need to work with your hands because that's how it all started. But now it's changing because we've moved from that way of doing things and describing letter forms to doing it different. So when I talk of from nib to Bezier curves, it's a technology that describes the outline of letter forms. And Pierre Bezier was an automobile designer who developed the mathematics behind describing curves. He worked for Porsche and Renault, I believe, in France. And as part of his automotive design, he needed to develop a mathematic to describe curves, because curves are very critical to automobile design for aerodynamics and so forth. And interestingly enough, that technology is now heavily adopted in virtually every font design application. So there's this crossover from other designers' work that was done for an entirely different use is now being adopted and used very much by font designers. So mastery of tools traditionally meant knowing how to scribe letters with a nib. And now increasingly now with computers. So everything is an outline on a computer, which is then filled in. And it is no coincidence whatsoever when you think of it that the word technology derives from the Greek techne, which is art and craft, and logia, which is systematic treatment. So think of it, we're using technology a great deal today, but at the heart of technology, there is a respect for craft and there's a respect for systems and systematic treatment. Steve Jobs, a pioneering technologist, got this, and he really got this. If somebody else came before Steve Jobs and brought computing to us, we might have some rubbish typography. He got it because he studied calligraphy at Reed College. And he was really, really fussy when he designed the Mac to ensure that the first fonts on the Macs had some of the finest lineage in terms of tradition and heritage. So, and he set the standards, which ultimately went on to describe every development in type that's technologically possible. So we owe a lot to people. And so in a sense, what it is the confluence of the right set of people with the right kind of temperament that make all of this possible. And Steve Jobs really contributed a great deal to fantastic typography. And on that note, I'd like to end on what RK once told me. And in fact, it's one of the greatest lessons you could offer anyone. And we were talking about type design, and he said, you know what? Draw a line as if it is the only purposeful act of your life. And only when you have mastered that, attempt to draw a letter form. Thank you.